Three cries cut through the blizzard. Two tiny German shepherd puppies pawing at the road, their little bodies shaking against the wind, begging the world to follow. No one else stopped. But down that same frozen stretch, a Navy SEAL named Michael Turner pressed the brakes, his headlights carving through the storm. He thought he'd left the battlefield behind until he saw what they were protecting. A mother dog, tied to a post, her head covered, her breath almost gone. In that moment, the soldier who had given up on saving himself knelt once more. For them. What happened next will remind you that heroes aren't always human. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The wind carried the weight of winter across the mountains, turning the narrow stretch of White Ridge Road into a ribbon of silver and silence. Snow drifted over the edges of the asphalt, and the pines on either side bent beneath its quiet burden. The world was motionless, frozen in a kind of mournful beauty that only those who have known solitude can understand. Navy SEAL Michael Turner drove carefully, the tires of his old gray SUV crunching against the icy surface. His face, angular and sun-worn, was half hidden beneath the shadow of a wool cap. The faint lines around his eyes were not from age, but from years of squinting against desert suns and battlefield smoke. He was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose silence seemed louder than any voice. A thin scar crossed the right side of his jaw, the only visible reminder of a war he rarely spoke of. Since his discharge 2 years ago, he had drifted from place to place, working odd security jobs, fixing old engines, sometimes disappearing for weeks into the wilderness. He said he liked the quiet, but the truth was he didn't know what to do without it. The heater groaned softly as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The snow thickened, and his headlights sliced through the white blur ahead. Then, out of nowhere, two small shapes burst from the trees. Michael slammed the brakes, the SUV sliding sideways before stopping just inches away. His pulse spiked. He leaned forward, and his breath caught. Two German shepherd puppies stood trembling in the road, barely 8 weeks old, their black and tan fur stiff with frost. They looked too small to be out here, their paws sinking into the snow as they tried to bark, but only produced soft, broken sounds. Their ribs showed faintly beneath their wet coats, and their amber eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto him. One of them took a hesitant step forward, then stood upright on its hind legs, front paws lifted toward him like a plea. The other mimicked it. Michael muttered, "What the hell?" under his breath, cutting the engine and opening the door. The cold bit his face instantly, the kind of chill that seeps through bone. He crouched down, palms open, speaking softly the way he used to with wounded dogs during deployment. "Easy there, little guys. I'm not going to hurt you." But the puppies weren't afraid. They were pleading. They whined, circled his boots, then darted a few feet down the road before stopping and turning back to him. When he didn't follow, they barked again, urgent, insistent. Something inside him stirred. That old instinct, the one that made him run toward danger instead of away. He stood, zipped his coat higher, and followed their tiny tracks through the snow. 50 yards ahead, he saw it. A dark shape slumped against a wooden post at the edge of the forest. As he drew closer, the outline became clear. A full-grown German shepherd, motionless except for a faint twitch of her chest. A coarse rope dug into her neck, tying her to the post. A black plastic sack covered her head, flapping weakly in the wind. Her body trembled, her legs half buried in snow. Michael's chest tightened. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, voice low and rough. He knelt beside her, gloved fingers gently pulling away the plastic. Beneath it was a face streaked with ice and exhaustion. Brown eyes clouded with pain, but still aware. The dog wheezed softly, and one ear twitched when he spoke. "You held on," he whispered. "You really held on." The two puppies cried and pressed against their mother's side, licking her muzzle. Michael felt the sting of something he hadn't let himself feel in years, helpless compassion. It had been so long since he'd saved anything that wasn't wearing a uniform. He worked quickly. The rope was thick, frozen stiff, but his survival knife was sharper. One clean slice, and it snapped free. The mother dog stumbled forward, collapsing into the snow. He caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently. Her fur was coarse beneath his hands, but still warm. Barely. "You're gonna be okay," he told her, as if saying it could make it true. He wrapped his coat around her and lifted her carefully into his arms. She was heavier than she looked, maybe 60 pounds. But Michael had carried worse through worse places. The puppies trotted after him, one limping slightly, both whimpering with anxious eyes that never left their mother. As he placed the dog in the back seat of his SUV, one of the puppies jumped in beside her. The other followed clumsily, their small bodies pressing close to keep her warm. Michael turned the heater to full and sat behind the wheel, watching the steam of their breath fog the window. He couldn't drive yet. His hands gripped the steering wheel, but his mind was somewhere else, years back, in Afghanistan, the night his team had been ambushed. The sound of gunfire, the snow-like dust, the way Sergeant Nolan had looked at him before the blast. He'd promised to bring everyone home. Only half of them made it. Ever since then, he'd wondered if some lives just weren't meant to be saved. But here, now, 3 sets of eyes looked at him, as if he could change that rule. As if the universe had given him one more chance to do what he'd failed to do before. He exhaled slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "All right, let's get you home." Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The headlights illuminated nothing but white. He eased the SUV back onto the road, driving slowly toward the small town 10 miles south Alpine Creek. Population barely 1,000. At that same hour, in a small house at the town's edge, Helen Brooks stared through her frosted kitchen window. At 70, she was a small, stooped woman with soft white hair always tied back in a bun, and a face lined more by kindness than by time. She lived alone, surrounded by pictures of her late husband, Arthur, who had been the town's police officer before he passed. In the evenings, she liked to feed the stray cats that gathered by her porch. But for 3 nights straight, she'd heard something different, a weak, distant barking that came from beyond the hills. Helen had called the local sheriff that morning, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "It's not the wind, it's a dog, a desperate one." She mentioned, too, the black truck she'd seen parked near the old lumber road, a truck with no plates that came and went after dark. The deputy promised to look into it, but in Alpine Creek, promises were easily frozen and forgotten. Helen sighed and pulled her shawl tighter, whispering to herself, "Someone needs to care." Back on White Ridge, Michael's SUV rolled to a stop under a flickering street lamp near the town's veterinary clinic. He carried the mother dog inside, kicking the door open with his boot. The smell of antiseptic and hay filled the air. The young vet, startled, rushed forward. Michael didn't waste words. She's been tied up for days. Hypothermic, maybe frostbitten. 2 pups with her. They need help. The vet, a woman in her 30s named Sarah Monroe, tall and lean with auburn hair, tied in a messy knot, took one look at the dog and didn't hesitate. Get them on the table. We'll warm them first. Her tone was sharp, competent. A scar on her left wrist hinted at a story she didn't tell. She worked quietly, wrapping the animals in thermal blankets, her gloved hands gentle and steady. Michael stood nearby, watching. His breath slowed for the first time in hours. When the mother dog opened her eyes again, faint but alive, the puppies pressed against her belly and began to whine softly in relief. Sarah smiled faintly. "You brought them just in time," she said. Michael didn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes reflecting the soft fluorescent light eyes that, for the first time in years, looked less like a soldier's and more like a man's. He left the clinic an hour later. Snow still fell, blanketing the road, but something inside him had shifted. The silence no longer felt empty. He glanced at the vet's window, where warm light glowed against the storm, then at the dark forest beyond, where the rope and the post still stood. He knew this wasn't over. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone would do it again. But for now, he had saved 3 lives, and maybe, in a small way, his own. He looked back once more before driving off. The puppies pressed against the glass, their tiny faces fogging the window. Michael whispered to himself, "You're safe now." And for the first time in years, he meant it. Morning unfolded slowly over Alpine Creek, a small mountain town tucked between ridges and frozen pines. The blizzard from the night before had softened into a quiet snowfall, laying a thin white veil over rooftops and fences. Inside the town's only veterinary clinic, the smell of antiseptic mingled with the warmth of electric heaters, and 3 sleeping figures lay curled together on a wool blanket. The German shepherd mother, now freed from her rope, rested her head between her front paws. A faint scar around her neck showed where the cord had cut deep, the fur rubbed raw. Her eyes were closed, her breathing calm but shallow. The 2 puppies, no bigger than a man's boots, pressed against her side, their fur soft and damp from the night before, rising and falling with each tiny breath. They slept without fear now, their small bodies twitching in dreams that Michael Turner hoped no longer contained the cold. Michael sat nearby in a wooden chair, his elbows on his knees, staring at the family he had found. The hum of the heater was the only sound. He hadn't slept since yesterday. His body was exhausted, but his mind was locked in motion. He thought about how they'd looked when he first saw them, the way the 2 pups had stood upright, begging, unafraid of him. He thought about how quickly he'd acted, how natural it had felt to run toward danger again. There was a familiarity to it, like muscle memory. But this time, the enemy wasn't armed men or gunfire. It was indifference, cruelty, the kind that hid behind silence. The door opened behind him, letting in a sharp breeze of cold air and the faint aroma of coffee. Dr. Sarah Monroe, the town's only veterinarian, entered with a paper cup in hand. She was tall and slender, with long auburn hair tied back in a loose braid, and a faint streak of silver near her temple that seemed out of place on someone barely in her mid-30s. Her pale skin was freckled from years of sunlight, and her hands, strong, precise, and steady, moved with the practiced calm of someone used to saving lives that couldn't say thank you. She smiled faintly as she saw him still sitting there. You've been here all night, haven't you? Michael gave a quiet nod. Couldn't really leave them. Sarah walked over, crouching beside the table where the dogs lay. They're lucky you didn't. The mother's strong, but she's been through hell. Frostbite on her paws, bruising on the ribs. Whoever tied her up didn't do it to kill her. They wanted her gone. That makes it worse in my book. Michael looked at her. You see this often? Sarah's expression darkened. More than I'd like to admit. Some breeders up in the hills dump dogs that can't be sold, or strays get trapped when hunting season ends. People around here pretend not to notice. Michael turned his gaze back to the dogs. So they came from somewhere nearby. Sarah nodded. Probably within a few miles. They wouldn't have wandered far with newborns. She hesitated, studying him. You're not from around here, are you? He shook his head. Just passing through. Or I was. She smiled softly. Alpine Creek has a way of keeping people who try to leave. Before Michael could reply, the clinic door opened again. A woman's voice, gentle and slightly unsteady, called out, "Hello? I heard someone found a German Shepherd and her pups." Both turned. Helen Brooks, wrapped in a thick beige coat and a knitted blue scarf, stood in the doorway, brushing snow from her sleeves. Her white hair peeked beneath a wool hat, and though her posture was frail, her eyes carried the alert kindness of someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention to small things others ignored. She held her purse tightly against her chest, the way elderly women do when they're nervous but determined. Sarah straightened. "Morning, Mrs. Brooks." "Yes, they're here. You want to see them, too?" Helen nodded eagerly and took slow steps forward, the click of her boots soft against the tile floor. When she reached the table and saw the mother dog, she froze. "Oh, mercy," she whispered, a hand rising to her chest. "That's her. I knew it." Michael stood, curious. "You've seen her before?" Helen's voice trembled as she spoke. "Yes, dear. She was behind my house, too, maybe 3 weeks ago. Poor thing looked terrified and thin as a bone. I tried to feed her, left out chicken and bread, but she wouldn't come close. She was pregnant then. I kept hoping she'd come back, but she vanished after a storm. I told the sheriff something bad had happened, but nobody listened." Michael's jaw tightened. "So she might have been living near you." Helen nodded. "There's an old orchard behind my house. Beyond that, a pine trail leads up to a ridge. There's a broken-down shed up there. Hunters used it long ago. I think that's where she was hiding. I saw her tracks in the snow leading that way." Sarah glanced at Michael. That could be where she gave birth. Helen sighed softly. "It breaks my heart to think someone might have taken her from there." Michael looked toward the dogs again, the mother's slow breathing, the pups nuzzling closer. "You said there's a trail?" Helen turned to him. "Yes. It's narrow, but still passable if you've got a decent truck. The old path runs behind the orchard fence. You'll see it between 2 cedar trees. Just follow it until the hill starts to rise." Sarah frowned slightly, folding her arms. "You're thinking of going up there now?" "I am," Michael said simply. "If someone tied her up, maybe there's more. Maybe whoever did it is still around." Helen looked alarmed. "You shouldn't go alone." Michael managed a faint, tired smile. "I've been alone a long time. I'll be all right." Sarah exhaled through her nose, a small show of resignation. "You military types never stop chasing ghosts, do you?" Michael paused at the door, turning back to them. "Sometimes you find something worth chasing." The line hung in the air for a moment. Helen's eyes softened, a flicker of something maternal passing over her face. "At least let me show you the way," she said gently. "The snow's still deep. You'll lose the trail if you don't know where to look." Michael hesitated, then nodded once. "All right, but you stay near the car." "I've lived in these woods all my life," Helen said, her tone half stern, half amused. "You just follow me." Sarah handed Michael his gloves from the counter. "Be careful," she said quietly. "If you find something, don't play hero. Bring it here, not to the sheriff. Trust me." He met her gaze for a brief moment. Two people who understood that trust was the rarest currency left in the world. Then walked out into the cold. The sun had risen higher, turning the snow to silver. Helen climbed into the passenger seat of Michael's truck, giving soft directions as they wound through the narrow roads. The forest loomed ahead, vast and quiet, its pines whispering under the wind. Helen's voice broke the silence now and then, pointing out landmarks from memory. The bridge where her husband once fished. The slope where children used to sled before the mill closed. Finally, they reached the old orchard. Rows of bare apple trees stretched into the distance, their branches heavy with frost. Helen pointed toward a thin break in the fence. There, between those two cedars, that's where the trail begins. Michael slowed the truck and stared into the woods. The snow was deeper there, untouched. Something in his chest stirred a strange mix of dread and duty. He looked back at Helen. "Thank you," he said quietly. Helen smiled faintly. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Turner. She deserves to be remembered kindly." Michael nodded. "We all do." He opened the door, the wind biting at his face once more. Behind him, the town of Alpine Creek lay small and peaceful, unaware that in its silence, a story of cruelty and survival had begun to stir again. He stepped into the trees, following the faint line of paw prints that led uphill through the snow. By the time his figure disappeared between the pines, Helen was still watching, hands folded in her lap. She whispered a quiet prayer into the cold. And that was how Michael Turner began the search for where it all began. The place where the mother dog had once believed she was safe. The forest beyond Helen Brooks's orchard stretched out like an endless cathedral of frost and silence. Snow clung to every branch, muffling sound, softening the world. Michael Turner's boots sank deep into it as he followed the faint trail upward, each breath clouding before him like smoke. The air smelled of pine and cold earth, pure, sharp, unkind. Behind him, Helen's small figure lingered at the edge of the orchard, watching with a mixture of fear and trust. She had shown him the way, but even she had refused to cross the fence. "You'll find it near the creek," she'd said, her voice trembling slightly. That's where she used to go. Now, miles from the road, Michael found the old trail narrowing into a corridor of trees. The prints ahead too large and too deliberate to be from the Puppies, cut through the snow in uneven intervals. Someone had been here not long ago. He moved slowly, cautious. Years of military training had carved a kind of rhythm into his movements, each step quiet, measured, instinctively scanning for patterns. But this was different. There were no gunmen in these woods, no explosions or traps, just the quiet cruelty of someone who had left animals to die. He came upon a clearing where the trees thinned out. Beneath a leaning oak stood the remains of a collapsed wooden shack, its roof half caved in, planks grayed with rot, the door hanging crooked on one hinge. Michael approached, brushing the snow from the threshold. Inside, the floor was littered with straw, torn rags, and the faint smell of something that had once been warm and alive. Near the back, he found it, a shallow nest carved into the dirt, lined with bits of old cloth and pine needles. He crouched down, touching the edge of it. A few tufts of fur clung to the rags, black and tan, unmistakably shepherd. The snow inside the nest had melted and refrozen, leaving a thin crust of ice. It hadn't been used for days, maybe longer. But it told a story. The edges were disturbed, claw marks torn into the earth. There had been struggle here, panic. Michael's jaw tightened. He could almost see it. The mother trying to defend her pups, the sound of footsteps, rough hands, barking, fear. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Somewhere above, a raven cried, its echo bouncing through the trees. He stood and scanned the ground again. The tracks were faint now, half buried by snow, but two distinct sets remained. One animal, one human. The human prints led down the hill toward the valley. He followed them carefully, moving through the trees until the slope began to descend toward a frozen stream. The forest opened slightly, revealing tire marks in the snow fresh enough that the ice hadn't yet filled them in. He crouched again, tracing the treads with his glove. Large tires, heavy-duty truck or van. The kind used by delivery companies, or maybe something less official. He took out his phone and snapped a photo before standing again. Behind him, a faint sound cracked through the stillness. Michael froze. He turned, scanning the trees. For a moment, nothing moved but the falling snow. Then, through the branches, he saw the flicker of movement, a shape, distant, slipping between trunks. Too far to make out. Human height. He raised his voice slightly, calm but firm. "Who's there?" No answer. Just wind. When he reached the spot, there were no footprints, only branches weighted by snow. Whoever it was had moved fast, or had been watching from farther away. Michael's instincts flared, the old battlefield sense that something unseen was close. He scanned again, but found nothing, only the echo of his own breath. He stayed there for another moment before turning back toward the creek. The water beneath the ice moved sluggishly, black against the white. Michael knelt near the edge and spotted something tangled in the brush on the opposite bank, a strip of blue nylon rope, frayed at both ends. The same kind that had been used to tie the mother dog. He pocketed it, a grim confirmation of what he already suspected. When he returned to the orchard later that afternoon, Helen was waiting by the fence, wrapped tightly in her beige coat. Snowflakes clung to her hat and shoulders. She looked up at him, with worry etched across her wrinkled face. "You found it, didn't you?" Michael nodded. "The den. It's been destroyed. Someone took her from there, probably not long before she gave birth." Helen's eyes watered, though she blinked it away quickly. "Poor thing. I knew it wasn't the weather that made her disappear." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't want to tell you earlier, but 2 nights before you found them, I saw something strange." Michael looked at her. "What kind of strange?" "A truck," she said softly. Dark color. Parked by the ridge road just before midnight. No lights on. I thought maybe hunters, but then I heard barking. Faint, like someone trying not to let it be heard. I called the sheriff again, but they said I was hearing things. Michael frowned. "You remember what kind of truck?" She shook her head. "Not exactly. But it had a dent in the left side panel and one headlight out. I saw it again the next evening, near the old lumber road by the creek." He absorbed that quietly. That's near where I found tire tracks. Helen nodded gravely. Then it's the same one. The wind picked up, stirring loose snow around them. Michael looked past the orchard toward the forest ridge. The thought of someone using those woods as a dumping ground for animals made his chest tighten. He'd seen too many forms of cruelty in his life, but this one, small and silent as it was, struck deeper than he expected. Helen's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's something else," she said. "Down the hill from that road, there's an old storage warehouse. Belonged to a man named Franklin Pike. Used to sell lumber. It's been shut down for years, but people say lights come on there sometimes at night." Michael turned to her. "A warehouse?" "Yes. You can see it from the highway if you drive past mile marker 22. He pulled his gloves tighter. "If they're keeping animals there, I'll find out." Helen looked uneasy. "You can't go alone. It could be dangerous." Michael smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "I've done dangerous before." Helen studied him for a moment, her eyes softening. "You remind me of my husband. He used to say the same thing right before walking into trouble." Michael's tone gentled. "He was a police chief, wasn't he?" She nodded. "He believed that if you stop answering when something calls for help, you stop being human." Michael looked down at the snow beneath his boots, then back at her. Sounds like he was right. He turned toward his truck, the wind biting harder now, the sky turning to dusk. Helen called after him, voice carrying across the orchard. "If you go, take the back road. The front gate's chained up." He raised a hand in acknowledgement before climbing into the truck. As the engine rumbled to life, he glanced once more in the mirror. Helen stood there, small against the white landscape, watching him disappear into the line of trees. The drive toward the base of the mountain was silent but tense. Twilight painted the snow in shades of blue and gray. He followed the narrow road that wound around the ridge, passing mile marker 22. There, half hidden behind drifts and dead brush, stood a warehouse, a long wooden structure with rusted metal doors and a faded sign that once read, "Pike Lumber Co." The windows were clouded with grime, and a new padlock gleamed on the front latch, catching the last light of day. Michael parked a distance away, stepping out quietly. The cold air stung his face, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He approached the door, brushing away snow from the handle. The padlock was heavy, industrial grade, and far too new for a place that had been closed for years. He touched it, then looked through a crack between the planks. Inside, he saw only darkness, but from deep within, faint and unmistakable, came the sound of movement and a single bark. Evening had fallen across the mountain like a slow-moving shadow. The air was brittle, carrying the smell of oil and snow, and the world had gone still except for the faint hum of Michael Turner's truck cooling beside the abandoned warehouse. The building loomed ahead of him, long and low, its faded wooden siding half swallowed by darkness. Rusted letters still clung to the sign above the door. Pike Lumber Co., a ghost of what it once was. Michael's breath rose white in the air as he studied the structure. The padlock was new, heavy steel, glinting faintly under his flashlight. It didn't belong here. Neither did the faint murmur he'd heard earlier, the soft thud of movement, and a short, muffled bark from inside. Michael circled the perimeter quietly, boots crunching on the frozen ground. At the back of the building, a row of small barred windows sat shoulder high. Most were boarded up. but one had a broken slat near the top. He angled his light inside. The beam cut through the dust and darkness, revealing rows of metal cages, too many. Inside a few of them, he saw shapes shift dogs, their fur dull, eyes wide and glassy under the sudden light. He counted at least a dozen. The smell hit him next. Ammonia, fear, neglect. He clenched his jaw. Someone was running a breeding mill out of this place. He could see plastic food buckets in one corner and the shine of metal chains. A shadow moved again, this time human. Michael dropped the light instantly and crouched low. Through the slit, he caught the silhouette of a man walking between the cages, carrying a flashlight of his own. The man was in his 40s, tall but thick-set, wearing a faded flannel jacket and work boots caked with mud. He stopped to check one cage, muttered something, and then disappeared deeper into the warehouse. Michael moved along the back wall, searching for another way in. He found a maintenance door, half buried under a collapsed gutter. The hinges were rusted but still held. He drew his knife, pried the latch, and slipped inside. The air was warm, thick with the stench of waste and wet fur. Dim bulbs hung from a line overhead, casting a weak orange light over the cages. The dogs whimpered at the sound of his steps. Most were German shepherds, some adults, some barely weaned. Several had scars along their flanks. One limped toward the bars, tail low, eyes pleading. Michael crouched beside it. "Easy, boy," he whispered. The dog pressed its nose through the gap, trembling. Michael recognized the look. It was the same as the mother dog's when he first found her. That same mixture of fear and desperate trust. A voice echoed from the far end. "Shut up or I'll make you shut up." The man with the flashlight returned, followed by another figure, a younger man, maybe late 20s, lean and jittery. His blonde hair stuck up in uneven clumps, and his voice carried the nervous energy of someone always expecting to be caught. "I told you we should have moved them out sooner," the younger man said. "That old lady's been calling the cops again." The older man grunted. "And they never listen. Relax. We'll finish the pickup tomorrow. The buyers are coming from Carson. After that, we torch the rest." Michael's hands curled into fists. Torch the rest. He scanned the area quickly. 2 men, both armed with flashlights, no visible guns. He could take them if needed, but not with the dogs trapped. He pulled back toward the maintenance door. Just as he was about to slip out, his boot brushed against a loose chain on the floor. The metallic clang rang sharp in the silence. The flashlight swung his way. "Who's there?" the older man barked. Michael bolted for the door. A shout followed, and the beam cut through the gloom. He ducked outside and ran for the truck, snow spraying under his boots. Behind him, the warehouse door slammed open. "Hey, you see that?" the younger one yelled. "Someone's out there." Michael jumped into his truck, started the engine, and killed the lights. The 2 men's flashlights scanned the road, sweeping across the trees, but missing the dark silhouette of his vehicle parked behind an old fuel tank. He waited, motionless, breath fogging the windshield. After a few minutes, the men gave up, muttering curses before heading back inside. When they were gone, he took out his phone, snapped photos of the warehouse, the license plate of an old red pickup parked beside it, and the cages through the window slit. Then he drove off into the night, tires spinning on the icy road. The drive back to Alpine Creek was long and silent. The town's few streetlights glowed dimly as he pulled up in front of a small police outpost, a squat building of brick and faded blue paint. Inside, the lights were still on. Behind the counter sat Deputy Carl Weller, a man in his 50s with a thick mustache and the tired look of someone who'd seen too much and done too little about it. He was broad-shouldered, his flannel shirt half untucked, and his badge crooked on his chest. Years on the job had dulled his ambition. Small-town problems didn't stir him anymore. Michael pushed the door open, shaking snow from his jacket. "Deputy, we need to talk." Carl barely looked up. "Can it wait till morning?" "No. There's a dog mill operating out by the old Pike warehouse. At least a dozen animals locked up. I saw 2 men, one tall, heavy-set dark hair, flannel jacket. The other younger, blonde. They're planning to move them tomorrow." Carl sighed and rubbed his temple. "People dump strays out there all the time. You probably saw old cages from before the closure." Michael leaned forward, his voice low but hard. "I was inside, Deputy. They're alive, and I've got photos." That got Carl's attention. He adjusted his glasses. Taking the phone, Michael slid across the counter. As he scrolled through the pictures, his expression changed from skepticism to discomfort. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's not good." "I need you to send a patrol out there tonight," Michael said. Carl hesitated. "We're short on staff. Sheriff's out at the next county for a meeting till morning." "Then call animal control. Anyone." Carl exhaled heavily. All right. I'll make some calls." Before he could, the door behind Michael opened, and Helen Brooks stepped inside, bundled in her winter coat. She must have seen his truck outside. "Mr. Turner," she said, breathless. "I heard you were here." Carl blinked. "Mrs. Brooks, what brings you out this late?" Helen's eyes were fierce despite her age. "You know what brings me here? I've been reporting stolen dogs for 3 months, and no one's lifted a finger." "Well, now you have proof. Do your job, Carl." Carl cleared his throat, embarrassed. "Mrs. Brooks, we're handling it." "You're handling it?" she said sharply. "You've been ignoring it. I may be old, but I can still tell when someone's sweeping dirt under the rug." Michael intervened gently. "Deputy, please. The longer we wait, the more danger those animals are in." Carl finally nodded, picking up the phone. "All right. I'll send 2 units in the morning to check it out." Helen folded her arms. "Morning? They said they're moving the dogs tonight." Carl looked uneasy. "Then we'll see what we can do sooner." Michael could tell by his tone that sooner meant never. He met Helen's eyes and gave a slight nod, silent understanding passing between them. A few minutes later, after leaving the station, Michael drove Helen back to her house. Snow fell thicker now, blanketing the town. The headlights washed over her porch as she turned to him. "You did what you could, son, but men like those don't like being watched." Michael looked toward the road. "I know. They'll come for whoever they think saw too much." Helen smiled sadly. "Then I suppose that means you and I are on the same list." He didn't smile back. "Lock your doors tonight." "I always do." When he finally returned to his cabin outside town, the night was deathly quiet. The forest loomed black beyond the windows. Inside, the fire he'd left earlier had gone cold. He tossed his jacket over a chair, sat down heavily, and stared into the darkness. In the silence, he could almost hear the echo of the mother dog's whimper from that first night. Somewhere in those woods, men were preparing to erase what he'd found. And deep down, Michael knew they wouldn't stop at the dogs. The next morning arrived under a sky the color of gunmetal, low and heavy, pressing down on the snow-covered valley. The world outside Michael Turner's cabin looked quiet, but he had learned long ago that quiet often meant danger waiting to breathe. The fire had burned down to ash in the hearth, and the room still smelled faintly of smoke and coffee. Michael stood by the window, his reflection merging with the pale blue of the glass. For a long moment, he watched the frozen tree line. The tracks from last night's truck were gone, erased by new snowfall, but something inside him told him that erasing tracks didn't erase intention. When he stepped outside, the cold bit into him immediately. The wind was slow, but sharp, like the edge of a blade dragged across skin. He moved toward his mailbox, a rusted metal box that leaned slightly from years of neglect. Inside, among the usual flyers and junk, lay a single folded piece of paper. No envelope, just thick paper, the kind that holds ink too dark to fade. He opened it and read the words printed in uneven block letters. "Return what's not yours." The ink was smudged, as if written in haste or by someone wearing gloves. Michael's jaw tightened. He scanned the surrounding trees. Nothing but snow and silence. Whoever left it had done so at night. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't believe in coincidences, and this coming just hours after his trip to the warehouse was no accident. Inside the cabin, the dogs stirred. The mother shepherd, now recovering well, lifted her head when he entered. Her name, Daisy, had come naturally to him the night before, when he realized how she watched over her pups with fierce patience. Her fur was fuller now, brushed and clean, her amber eyes alert. The two puppies, smaller copies of her with slightly lighter coats, tumbled at her side, play fighting before collapsing into sleep again. For a moment, Michael felt something almost human loosen in his chest. They were safe, for now. But safety had a habit of vanishing without notice. He crouched beside them, resting his hand gently on Daisy's neck. "You're not going anywhere," he murmured. "Not again." A soft knock at the door broke the quiet. He stood quickly, hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt, before realizing it was broad daylight and that no one else ever came this far out without a reason. When he opened the door, Helen Brooks stood there, wrapped in her thick beige coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. Her white hair had escaped its hat, and her breath came out in small clouds. "Morning, Mr. Turner," she said, with that polite firmness only older women could manage. "You didn't answer your phone." "I didn't hear it," he said. "Everything all right?" "I could ask you the same," she replied, stepping inside when he motioned her in. Her eyes immediately went to the dogs, and her expression softened. "They look better." "They're healing fast," he said quietly. She nodded approvingly before turning serious. "I heard from someone at the diner this morning that the police didn't go to that warehouse last night." Michael gave a grim smile. Not surprised. Deputy Weller's more worried about keeping his chair warm than doing his job. Helen sighed, removing her gloves. "I told Carl years ago that his laziness would get someone hurt. Looks like it still might." She glanced at him. "You got any sleep?" He shook his head. "Found something else this morning." He handed her the note. Helen read it once, her face tightening. "This isn't some prank," she said. "They're warning you off." "I figured," Michael replied, "but I don't back off." Helen studied him quietly for a moment. Her eyes, gray and sharp despite her age, searched his face. "You remind me of Arthur," she said at last. "He used to look just like that before he went after someone dangerous, and he'd never listen either." Michael gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's why we both married into trouble." Helen chuckled softly, but her expression didn't soften. Then you'll need to be smart about it. You can't take them head-on, not when you don't know how many there are. She reached into her bag and unfolded a map, yellowed with age and marked with red pencil lines. My husband drew this years ago when he was tracking smugglers through these woods. There are back roads, service paths, and an old fire trail that loops behind the ridge. Criminals use them to move unnoticed. I'd bet those men still do. Michael leaned over the table as she spread the map open. Her hands, though wrinkled, moved with practiced precision. Here, she said, pointing to the edge near the Pike warehouse. This trail splits in two. One goes toward the sawmill road, the other cuts behind the ridge and reconnects near the frozen lake. If you follow it, you'll see where trucks have been coming through. It's hidden from the main highway, perfect for moving things nobody's supposed to see. He traced the line with his finger. If that's true, there might be more than one site. Helen nodded gravely. Arthur believed that too. He just never had proof. Michael sat back, eyes narrowing as plans began to form in his head. I'll need to check those roads, set up some warnings around here first. If they're planning to come after me, or anyone, they won't get close without me knowing. Helen looked uneasy. What about calling for help? Someone from outside the county? Won't matter, he said. By the time they send anyone, this will be over, one way or another. She frowned, but didn't argue. Instead, she handed him another folded paper, a page torn from a small notebook. Arthur used to mark hidden spots in the forest places where you can set traps or alarms without being seen. If you're going to play soldier again, you might as well do it right. Michael took the page, his eyes meeting hers. You sure you're all right being part of this? Helen smiled faintly. I'm too old to start pretending I don't care. By afternoon, Michael had gone to work. The snow around the cabin was knee-deep, crunching under his boots as he moved through the trees, marking distances and setting lines. He built small warning traps, a habit carried from his military days, using tripwire and empty cans. Simple but effective. They wouldn't hurt anyone, but they'd make noise, and noise was enough. Each step he took was careful, methodical, the way he used to clear perimeters overseas. The difference now was that what he protected wasn't soldiers or equipment. It was a wounded animal and two fragile lives that had never known kindness until now. By sunset, the traps were ready. The wind had picked up again, shaking snow from the trees in soft flurries. He returned to the cabin, mud streaking his boots, fingers numb. Inside, Daisy wagged her tail weakly as he entered, and the puppies bounced toward him, their small paws slipping on the floorboards. Michael crouched and let them climb onto his lap. For a man who had spent years believing his heart had gone numb, he was surprised to feel its weight again. Helen stopped by once more that evening, carrying a pot of soup in both hands. You look like you've been wrestling the mountain, she said as she stepped in. I've seen worse, Michael replied with a smile. They ate quietly, the fire crackling between them. Helen studied the traps laid out on his table, her brow furrowed. You're sure this will be enough? It'll buy time, he said. And sometimes, time's all you need. When she left later, the sky had gone dark. Michael stood by the door, watching her figure fade into the snowy night. He could still see the faint trail of her footprints leading down the hill. He waited until the sound of her car engine faded before locking the door. The cabin grew still again. Only the dogs stirred, their quiet breathing filling the silence. Michael reached into his pocket and unfolded the note one last time, reading it under the glow of the firelight. The ink looked darker now, the letters heavier. Return what's not yours. He stared at it for a long time, then fed the paper into the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished. Outside, the first of his warning cans rattled faintly in the wind. It was only the breeze, or so he hoped. But he stayed standing for a long time anyway, listening. The night came in heavy and slow, pressing down on the valley like a held breath. Snow fell thick and soundless, blanketing every tree and roof until even the forest seemed to disappear beneath it. Inside the cabin, only the soft crackle of the fire broke the stillness. Michael Turner sat at the wooden table, the map Helen Brooks had given him spread beneath a dim lamp. Pencil marks traced the ridgelines and hidden paths she'd shown him earlier, and next to it lay his knife, a coil of wire, and the flashlight he'd rewired into a makeshift signal device. The note he had burned that morning still echoed in his head. Return what's not yours. Daisy, the mother German shepherd, lay by the fireplace, her black and tan coat glowing in the firelight. Her two puppies slept curled against her belly, their small bodies rising and falling in rhythm. Occasionally, one would twitch, dreaming, and she'd lick its ear gently before resting her head back down. There was no sound, but the faint whistle of wind through the cracks in the cabin walls. Michael's eyes moved to the window. Snowflakes glimmered like static under the moonlight. Something about the quiet felt too perfect. He stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The traps he'd set earlier, tripwires strung low across the path. Cans hidden under branches were buried under a thin sheet of snow now, but they were still in place. He checked each one quickly, movement steady, methodical. Old habits died hard. A faint crunch reached his ears, the unmistakable sound of a footstep, distant but deliberate. He froze. The forest had stopped breathing. He killed the cabin's light from the switch near the porch. The world went dark, except for the ghostly silver of the snow. Michael waited. Another sound, closer this time, the scrape of boots against ice. He dropped into a crouch, scanning the tree line. Two figures emerged slowly from the shadows, silhouettes against the dim moonlight. One carried a flashlight with a red filter, the other a crowbar. Michael recognized them instantly, the same men from the warehouse. The older one was heavy-set, his flannel jacket flapping open despite the cold. His breath came out in thick clouds. The younger one was thinner, twitchy, a baseball cap pulled low over greasy blonde hair. They whispered, their voices muffled but clear enough for Michael to catch fragments. He's got them dogs inside. Boss wants him quiet. Michael slipped back toward the porch, heart steady. He didn't feel fear, not the kind that froze you, but the alertness that came just before everything went wrong. Inside the cabin, Daisy lifted her head, ears pricking. She smelled it too, the foreign scent of anger and metal. Michael grabbed the shotgun he kept by the door, loaded with rock salt instead of bullets. He didn't plan to kill anyone, but he'd make sure they remembered stepping foot here. Outside, the wind shifted. The older man gestured toward the back window. "Go round," he hissed. "We'll break through at the same time." The younger one nodded and moved toward the rear, leaving a trail of deep prints in the snow. Michael followed his path through the shadows, keeping low. When the man reached the back door, Michael waited for the exact moment the crowbar hit the wood then flicked on his flashlight and fired once. The blast cracked through the night. The man yelped, clutching his shoulder as the rock salt tore through his jacket. He stumbled back, swearing, falling into the snow. The older man shouted, charging toward the front. Inside, Daisy barked sharply, once, twice, before pushing her body between the puppies and the door. Michael spun toward the porch, just as the older man kicked it open. The door splintered, the wind sweeping snow into the room. The man lunged forward, swinging the crowbar. Michael sidestepped, catching his arm and twisting hard. The weapon clattered to the floor. "Where are they?" The man snarled through clenched teeth. Michael didn't answer. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him back. The two crashed into the table, scattering the map and tools. The fire flickered violently. From outside came another sound, the limping younger man shouting for help. "He's armed. He's got a—" The rest was drowned out by Daisy's growl. She lunged from the fireplace, teeth bared, snapping at the man's leg as he tried to get up. He yelled and kicked, but the dog didn't let go. Her strength surprised even Michael. The older man, stunned, reached for his jacket pocket, but Michael was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist and slammed him against the wall, pinning him there. "You touch that trigger," Michael said lowly, "and you'll wish I'd let her finish the job." The man glared, breath ragged. "You think you can stop us? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Maybe not," Michael said, "but you picked the wrong soldier to scare." Outside, headlights flashed faintly through the trees, distant, moving fast. For a second, Michael thought the men had more backup coming, but then he realized something. The lights weren't from the forest. They were coming from the town road. Miles away, Helen Brooks had been sitting by her window with a cup of tea gone cold when she noticed the flicker of light across the ridge. She had promised Michael she'd keep watch, though she hadn't expected anything this soon. Now, through the falling snow, she saw faint bursts of light like gunfire or flares near his cabin. She dropped her mug and hurried to the phone. When Deputy Carl Weller picked up, half asleep, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "Carl, it's Helen Brooks. There's trouble up by the Turner cabin. Send your men now." Carl grumbled, still half in disbelief, but something in her tone snapped him awake. Within minutes, the small town siren began to wail faintly across the valley. 2 patrol trucks rolled out into the snow. Back in the cabin, Michael pushed the older man toward the door, forcing him outside. The younger one had managed to crawl to his feet, but froze when the distant wail of sirens reached them. "Cops," he hissed. "Looks like your friends called ahead," Michael said coldly. The older man's face twisted in anger. "You won't make it out of this." Michael raised his shotgun. "Then I'll take you with me." The men didn't wait to test the threat. They bolted into the woods, stumbling through the drifts. Michael didn't chase. He closed the door, bracing it with a chair, then turned back to Daisy, who was panting, blood flecking her muzzle where the man's boot had scraped her. He knelt and ran his hand over her head. "You did good, girl." Moments later, the red and blue lights of police cruisers flared through the snow, bathing the trees in color. Officers spilled out, guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the night. Carl Weller himself climbed out of the lead vehicle, his breath forming clouds as he shouted, "Turner, you in there?" Michael opened the door slowly, hands visible. "You're late." Carl scowled but didn't argue. 2 officers moved past him to search the tree line. After several tense minutes, one of them returned. Found footprints leading east. Looks like two men took off toward the ridge. Carl turned back to Michael. You all right? Michael nodded. Thanks to her, he said, glancing toward Daisy. Carl followed his gaze, his face softening briefly. Guess we owe her a steak. Helen arrived shortly after, bundled in her coat, her boots crunching on the snow. She looked pale but steady. I saw the flashes from town, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I thought, Michael smiled faintly. You did exactly what I needed you to do. She exhaled shakily. And the dogs? They're fine, he said. We all are. Outside, the sirens faded, and the snow began to ease. For the first time in days, the sky above Alpine Creek cleared. The stars were sharp and bright, scattered across a deep indigo canvas. Michael stood at the doorway, the cold air brushing his face. Behind him, Daisy lay curled with her pups, asleep by the fire once more. The snow had stopped falling. The night was quiet again, but this time, it was the quiet of safety, not fear. The days after the attack passed like slow-moving clouds. The snow that had once buried the town began to soften under a gentler sun, revealing patches of brown earth and glimmers of green that hinted at spring. For the first time in weeks, the air carried the smell of thawing pine and wet soil instead of smoke and fear. Michael Turner stood outside his cabin, the one that had nearly become a battleground, and watched the mist rise from the trees. The world seemed to be breathing again. Inside, Daisy stretched on the rug, her black and tan coat gleaming in the soft light. Her injuries had healed. The small scar on her side was the only trace of that night. She was calmer now, her eyes no longer darting toward every sound. Her two puppies, Scout and Riley, were bundles of restless energy tumbling over each other, chewing on a torn glove, barking at the kettle when it whistled. Michael couldn't help but smile each time he saw them. He had begun to talk to them more than he talked to people, though none of them seemed to mind. That morning, Deputy Carl Weller had driven up to the cabin, the crunch of his tires breaking the silence. He stepped out of his cruiser, his thick frame wrapped in a worn sheriff's coat. The man looked older in daylight gray stubble shadowing his chin, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. He had the expression of someone who'd finally been forced to look at the mess he'd ignored for too long. "Morning, Turner," he greeted, tugging his gloves off. "Morning, Deputy," Michael replied evenly. Carl shuffled awkwardly before speaking again. "The men from the warehouse both in custody. Feds are moving in on the rest of their operation. Turns out it wasn't just dogs. They'd been smuggling stolen goods from 3 states. You did us all a favor." Michael nodded, but said nothing. He didn't do it for medals or headlines, and Carl seemed to understand that. The older man rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Sheriff wanted me to tell you. The department's grateful. Folks in town, too. Some of those dogs already got new homes. Helen's been making sure of that." At her mention, Michael smiled faintly. "Sounds like her." Carl looked at him for a long moment before saying, "You could have left after that night, but you didn't. Any reason you're still here?" Michael's gaze drifted toward the forest. "Sometimes a man needs to stop running." Carl nodded thoughtfully, then tipped his hat and walked back to his cruiser. As he drove off, Michael realized how rare it was to hear the sound of gratitude in another man's voice. It was heavier than silence, but it stayed with him. Later that afternoon, Helen Brooks came by. She was carrying a basket wrapped in a red checkered cloth soup, biscuits, and her usual scolding about how men forgot to eat when they worked too much. She had aged gracefully, with white hair neatly pinned and sharp eyes that missed nothing. The years had given her a softness in voice, but not in will. She still walked with the quiet determination of someone used to doing things alone. "You look better," she said as she stepped inside. "Less like a ghost and more like someone who's remembered how to live." Michael chuckled. "That's one way to put it." She set the basket on the table, glancing at the puppies sniffing her shoes. "And you, look at these little miracles. Riley's getting big." "Too big," Michael said, watching as Riley tried to drag Scout across the floor by the tail. "They've turned the place into a circus." Helen laughed softly, but her smile faded when her eyes drifted toward the window. "I still can't believe what those men did. My Arthur used to say, evil doesn't always look like monsters. It looks like neighbors who stop caring." Michael didn't answer right away. "You miss him?" "Every day," she admitted. "But I think he'd be proud of what's happened here. Proud of you, too." He looked at her curiously. "Why me?" "Because you gave this town something it lost a long time ago. Courage," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You didn't just save those dogs, Michael. You reminded people that goodness still fights back." He turned his gaze to the fire, unsure how to respond. Compliments made him uneasy. They always had. After years in service, he'd learned that heroism rarely felt like glory. It felt like exhaustion that refused to quit. Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's something I wanted to show you," she said, handing it over. "It's a property deed. Belonged to Arthur and me. A cabin just down the road from mine. It's been empty since he passed." Michael frowned slightly. "Helen, I can't." "Yes, you can," she interrupted softly but firmly. "You've earned it. Besides, I'd feel better knowing someone like you was nearby. That old cabin's been lonely long enough." He unfolded the paper, scanning the faded ink. The location was just a few hundred yards from her house, close enough for company, far enough for solitude. "You really want me there?" Helen smiled. "You helped bring peace back to this place. It should give something back to you. And..." Her eyes softened. "I think you can use a home that's yours again." Michael didn't answer immediately. His life had been built on movement, on leaving before roots could form. But when he looked at Daisy and her pups, their tails wagging by the hearth, he realized something had changed. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive. That evening, he walked down the road with Helen to see the cabin. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, its walls aged to silver gray, the porch covered in snow but sturdy beneath. A weathered wind chime swayed from the eaves, singing softly in the wind. Helen stood beside him, her breath forming small clouds. "Arthur built it himself, after retiring from the force," she said. "He said a man should always have a place where the world can't find him." Michael ran a hand over the wooden railing. "Looks like the world found him anyway." Helen nodded quietly. "It always does, but you make it leave again." He turned to her, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "You're not going to take no for an answer, are you?" "Not a chance," she said, eyes twinkling. "I'm too old to start losing arguments now." Michael laughed softly, the sound echoing through the trees. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take it." Helen's smile widened, the kind that came from deep relief rather than triumph. "Good. Then it's settled. You'll move in once the snow clears." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sunset bleed through the pines. The air smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and somewhere in the distance, the faint howl of a coyote rose before fading again. When they walked back toward town, Helen slipped her arm through his. It was a simple gesture, but it said more than words ever could. For a man who had spent years alone, hunted by his own ghosts, the warmth of shared steps felt like redemption. That night, as he sat by the fire again, the puppies asleep at his feet, and Daisy resting her head on his knee, Michael felt a quiet he didn't want to end. Not the silence of loss or battle, but the kind that came when the world finally stopped demanding you fight it. For the first time, in a long time, he let himself believe he might stay. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because this time he wanted to. The thaw had come slowly to White Ridge, but it had finally arrived. Days stretched longer. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and damp earth, and the snow that had once silenced the mountains now melted into thin streams that ran beneath the cabin porch. Michael Turner stood outside in the morning light, his breath no longer fogging in the air. The winter that had almost broken him had turned into a spring that promised something he hadn't known in years: peace. Inside, the sound of life filled the cabin. Daisy, his German shepherd, now strong and proud again, paced slowly near the hearth, watching her two puppies wrestle on the rug. He had named them Rust and Marlowe. Rust for the reddish tint in his fur. Marlowe for the quiet way he always followed his mother. Eyes curious and calm. Daisy had regained her full weight, her coat shining deep gold and black. Her scars were fading, but the fire in her eyes remained. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, and in that, she mirrored her owner perfectly. Michael poured coffee into an old enamel mug and leaned against the counter, watching the dogs play. The smell of fresh pine drifted through the cracked window. A few weeks had passed since the night of the attack, the night the snow had stopped breathing. And since then, the world had softened. The warehouse was now a ruin of yellow police tape and silence. The men responsible were behind bars, awaiting trial. The town that had once turned a blind eye to its shadows had begun to open its eyes again. He had spent those weeks repairing what the storm and violence had broken: the porch railing, the cracked window, the trust of those who lived nearby. People stopped him in town now, not to stare, but to thank him. He was uncomfortable with it at first, unused to the warmth of gratitude. But even that was beginning to feel natural. That afternoon, Helen Brooks arrived, as she did nearly every day, her scarf fluttering in the wind and her cheeks pink from the walk up the hill. She carried a wicker basket filled with baked bread and leftover stew. And when Michael opened the door, she brushed snow from her coat, like she had lived this ritual her whole life. "I told you," she said, smiling. "I won't let you starve out here." Michael grinned faintly. "You've already turned this place into a diner." Helen stepped inside, setting the basket on the table. "Then eat before I start charging." She looked around the cabin, the freshly mended shelves, the blooming plant on the windowsill, the soft chaos of dog toys. "You've made it a home," she said, her tone warm but wistful. Michael poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. "Didn't think I'd ever have one again," he said quietly. Helen studied him over the rim of her cup. "You mean a home or a reason?" "Maybe both." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence. The fire crackled. Rust gnawed on a stick under the table, while Marlowe watched the sparks with fascination. Helen reached down to pet Daisy, who leaned into her touch like she'd known her all her life. "You know," Helen said softly, "Arthur would have liked you. He always believed people found their way back to kindness eventually, if someone gave them the chance." Michael smiled faintly. "Sounds like he gave you plenty." Helen's eyes softened. "He did. And now I get to pass it on." There was something about the way she said it, calm, content, that made him realize she wasn't just helping him. She was healing too. She had lost her husband, lost her sense of purpose, and now she had found both again, not because she was needed, but because she had something left to give. Every time she came up that hill, every time she brought food, stories, laughter, she was filling the silence her husband left behind with meaning. Later that week, Michael began moving into the new cabin Helen had offered him, the one Arthur had built years ago. The place needed work. A roof that groaned in the wind, a porch that sagged slightly, and windows that rattled when the breeze turned cold. But he didn't mind. He'd seen worse roofs in worse places. With every nail he drove and every board he replaced, he felt something mending inside him too. One afternoon, while hammering the final board on the porch railing, a truck rolled up the path. It was Deputy Carl Weller again, though this time he looked different. He was freshly shaven, wearing a pressed uniform, and there was something lighter about him. "Town meeting tonight," he said with a grin. "They're giving you a thank you certificate." "Don't make me drag you there." Michael laughed. "You really think I need a piece of paper?" Carl shrugged. "Nah, but the mayor does. Makes people feel better about things." He paused, glancing at Daisy and the pups lying in the grass nearby. "You keeping them all?" Michael looked at them. Daisy watching the horizon, Rust rolling in the mud, Marlowe staring at a butterfly. "Yeah," he said. "Feels like they found me as much as I found them." Carl nodded. "Guess we all need saving from something." When the truck disappeared down the road, Michael stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind mixing with the laughter of the dogs. He thought about what the deputy had said. Maybe redemption wasn't about forgetting the past. Maybe it was about finally having something to protect again. That evening, the sun set in wide streaks of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the porch. Helen came up the path with her usual determination, a wool blanket draped over her arm. "For the porch," she said when he opened the door, "and maybe for us." They sat together as the light faded, Daisy lying at their feet, her puppies chasing one another across the yard. The air was cool but gentle, the kind that carried the smell of life returning. Helen watched the dogs play, her face lit by the last glow of sunset. "You know," she said softly, "families don't always come the way we expect. Sometimes they're built out of second chances." Michael nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Or out of snow," he said quietly. "Cold at first, but if you stay long enough, it melts into something good." Helen smiled, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Then I suppose we'll just have to stay." As the final light slipped behind the ridge, the cabin stood warm against the darkening sky. Daisy curled beside the steps, the pups tumbling into her side, their laughter like barks echoing through the air. For the first time since his days in uniform, Michael felt whole, not as a soldier, not as a savior, but as a man who had finally come home. And in that quiet, under the fading winter stars, a family, built not by blood, but by kindness, came to rest together. In a world where cruelty can hide behind closed doors and kindness often feels too small to matter, what happened in White Ridge was nothing short of a miracle. Maybe not the kind that splits the sky or moves mountains, but the kind that changes hearts. Quietly, persistently, one act of compassion at a time. A soldier who'd lost his faith found it again through the loyalty of a wounded dog. A lonely widow rediscovered her purpose through giving. And somewhere in between, 3 lives once left to die in the snow became the heartbeat of a new family. Perhaps that's what God's miracles look like. Not flashes of light, but people crossing paths at the exact moment they need saving. Maybe it's His way of reminding us that even in our coldest seasons, love still finds a way to melt what's frozen. So if you believe that no act of kindness is ever wasted, that faith can be reborn from brokenness, and that every creature deserves a chance to be loved, share this story. Leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe that hope still walks among us. May God bless you. Keep your heart gentle and guide your hands toward compassion, because the next miracle He writes might begin with you.